very proud of the history of St. Augustine, very protective of it as well. But I'm all about the real history. I don't like cleansed history, don't like whitewashed history, God forbid fake history. History's not always pretty. There's not always good people in it. But we can learn from all of it. Now, our history gets started here in St. Augustine, September 8th of 1565. Makes us the oldest continuously occupied European settlement in all of North America. That's a huge mouthful to say, so we just call ourselves the oldest city. Founded by the Spanish, and our first Spanish colonial period lasts nearly 200 years, until 1763, at which time by treaty we are handed off to the British. But our British period is short. It's only 21 years long, 1763 to 1784. But it does encompass the entire American Revolution, so it's somewhat historically important. Once those Brits lose and they are kicked out, Spain by treaty is given back Florida. We have a second Spanish colonial period, 1784 to 1821. Then we finally become an American territory. 1845, we become the 27th state in the Union. And then after that, we have a very important period of our history here in St. Augustine. It's really important for all of Florida. We refer to it as the Flagler era. If you have never heard of Henry Flagler, you're about to in great detail on this tour. Right. Historically significant here in St. Augustine is we step all the way back to the year 1702. Now in 1702, we're still in our first Spanish period. We're already 137 years old as a city. It sounds kind of crazy, but we are. And in that year, we suffer our first sustained attack on the city. Now I say sustained attack. We've had skirmishes and raids throughout the years. This is the first time someone's tried to come in and take us over. And of course it's the British, because they're always the bad guys in these stories. They come out of the Carolina colony. Now I say Carolina because South Carolina doesn't even exist yet for another 9 years. Governor Moore leads his British forces down to attack Spanish Florida, which means attacking its capital at that time, St. Augustine. Now our fort, which we see off in the distance, is already built at this time. It's only 7 years old as a fort, but fully functional. And just prior to the arrival of the British, the citizens of St. Augustine are evacuated out of the city into the fort for their safety. And they are perfectly safe during the entire 56-day siege. The fort is indestructible for the time period. Governor Moore and his British forces are unable to take the fort, therefore they cannot militarily control the area. And once reinforcements finally arrive from Havana, Cuba, yes, 56 days to get here, he is forced to retreat. But before he does that, he burns down the evacuated city of St. Augustine. So we have no buildings in the city older than 1702 for that very reason, except for the fort. And at that time, we decide it's time to start protecting the rest of the city. We start building walls around St. Augustine. Now, our first wall runs from the fort right down where Orange Street is crossing here today and all the way over to the San Sebastian River. It's known as the Cubo Line. The Cubo Line creates St. Augustine as a walled-off peninsula, surrounded on three sides by rivers. A second wall is constructed right down where we see Cordova Street today, known as the Rosario Line, and the two walls teed together right at this intersection. So when I say colonial St. Augustine, it's actually just that quadrant over there. The area to the right of the Rosario Line was a low, marshy, lightly inhabited area, and it wasn't considered part of the city at that time. Now the walls are pretty impressive. 9 to 10 foot tall earthen mounds, and they're fortified on either side by inverted palm logs. All along the city wall are fortified bunkers known as redoubts. We have a recreation of a redoubt right behind me here. These bunkers would house men with cannons and muskets to help defend the city wall. 13 of these existed around the city. We're such a tiny city at that point. 13 of these, we have one about every 200 yards. It's a well-defended, well-fortified city wall, and in fact, that wall is never breached. From its completion in 1704 till its final deconstruction in the year 1836. That takes us well into the American period, and at that point, we have no need for a city wall. So while the wall exists, it does its job. The only portion of our city wall that still remains today is our city gates. That's where we'll end our tour a little later on today. Everything else is recreation. Now, as we step across the old Cubo Line, which is today's Orange Street, as we're walking by, I do want you to notice right on the corner of the street, right in front of Potter's Wax Museum, you're going to see a park bench. Seated on that park bench is a statue of one Henry Flagler. That's how Mr. Flagler would have appeared when he first comes to St. Augustine. He's 53 years of age. He has stepped away from the day-to-day operations of Standard Oil. You could make a case that he is the very first retiree to move to Florida. My goodness, did he start a trend. Welcome to the Talamato Cemetery, the oldest Catholic cemetery in all of Florida. This becomes our city's official Catholic cemetery in 1737. But as you look around the Talamato, you only see about 100 standing headstones and above-ground crypts. There's over 1,100 burials here that we know of. Most of them are unmarked, and most of that is due to the British period. The British come in 1763. They are Protestant. They hate the Spanish, and they hate the Catholics. They tear down our Indian church and use it for firewood. Tear up all the wooden cross markers from the old Spanish cemetery and use that for firewood as well. Those British, they seem so sweet. I can't believe people didn't like them during that period. So most of the graves here are unmarked. In fact, you couldn't put 1,100 burials in this piece of property if you tried. It's far too small. When they put the walls and fences up around the cemetery decades later, they only encase the standing headstones. The burials run out in every direction under all the homes and buildings. It's a very common occurrence here in St. Augustine. We have bodies buried everywhere. We find them all the time. But the reason Henry Flagler was acquiring a ton of land when he comes to Florida harkens back to his first visit to St. Augustine. Now, when he first comes to the city, your Eastern Seaboard Railroad coming south stops coming south continuously in Jacksonville, Florida. After that, you have to catch a ferry across the St. Johns River. And then a horse-drawn rail car, the additional 18 miles into the city of St. Augustine. Hot, miserable, and a little bit dangerous. Mr. Flagler knows the rich and powerful folks he's targeting with his hotels, they're never going to travel in that fashion. To solve the problem, he buys all the local rails south of the St. Johns River. 3 small railroads not connected to each other. They don't even share the same gauge of rail. But he creates the Florida East Coast Railway. Now, that's a thriving company to this very day. It runs up and down the eastern seaboard of Florida. He builds the first railroad bridge across the St. Johns River and brings the railroad right into St. Augustine, so his guests can arrive in comfort and style. The state of Florida loves what he does with this. It's going to develop the area. And at this point in our state's history, we are the poorest and least populated of all 44 states. We're so poor as a state, we can't even afford to build our own infrastructure. Men like Henry Flagler can't afford it. So the state issues him a charter. The charter allows Henry Flagler to build infrastructure in the state of Florida in the form of railroad in exchange for Florida land. The deal ends up netting Henry Flagler for each mile of rail he builds in the state. He received 3,480 acres of Florida land along the tracks. Henry knows a good deal when he hears it. By the time he passes away in 1913, he has extended that railroad all the way to Key West. Needless to say, Florida owes him a lot of land. To make the land pay off, he creates the real estate company. But in the end, everyone wins. The state of Florida got that infrastructure built they never could afford to build on their own. Mr. Flagler gets his money back out of the investment by selling off the land he's given in exchange. And the people of Florida win because industry and opportunity come into places they never existed before. And he really creates Florida in the modern sense that we know today. Now, when I say that, I mean it. When Henry Flagler comes to St. Augustine, it's a city we've been here forever, but we're a dying town. We're being replaced by Jacksonville, Florida. It's already on the Eastern Seaboard Rail. It's a deeper water port, and they're replacing us. South of St. Augustine, you had 2 small fishing villages at Ormond and Daytona. The next true city south of that is Key West. There's no South Florida to speak of until Henry Flagler takes the railroad there. So to say he built modern Florida, he literally built modern Florida. Now, when he's building his first luxury hotel here in St. Augustine, the Ponce de Leon, which we'll see in just a little while, he realizes immediately, as he starts construction, he's going to have another problem. And the problem is, there's just nothing fun to do in 1880 St. Augustine. To solve that problem, I'll tell you at the next stop. Now, to solve the problem of nothing fun to do in 1880 St. Augustine, Mr. Flagler wants to start a second hotel. The one with all the amenities inside, all the fun stuff to do. He wants his 2 hotels to face each other so both can use the amenities of the second. And we're on the back of the old Ponce de Leon Hotel, so it'd be the other side from where we stand right now. The problem with his plan, the land he's picked out for that second hotel is already occupied by a small wooden church, the Olivet Methodist Episcopal Church. And even though it's a small wooden church, it's less than 18 months old. It is brand new to them, and they don't want to sell their brand new church. Mr. Flagler makes them an offer they cannot refuse. He says, I'll build you a brand new church, much nicer than the one you have. Give you the church and the land in exchange for your land. They agree. And what they get is this. Grace United Methodist opened its doors January 1 of 1888. It looked just like this. This is the original construction. Now, this was a tremendous step up for the religious communities here in St. Augustine. Traditionally, we're a Catholic town still at that point due to our Spanish heritage. So non-Catholic denominations were rather small at this time. The congregation that moved into this church was between 3 and 4 dozen. Wow. It's less than 50 people. February 9th of 1889, Mr. Flagler's last remaining daughter, Jenny Louise, age 34. She's expecting her first child. This is going to be Henry's first grandchild. This is taking place in New York City. Mr. Flagler's here for the winter season. Well, there are complications with the birth, and little Marjorie only lives about 9 hours till she passes away. Jenny Louise and her husband are devastated, as is Mr. Flagler. He invites them to come down for the rest of the winter season to recover from this horrible event. On the way down, she dies as well. Complications from the birth, most likely a late hemorrhage. This is what the second richest man in the country does with a broken heart. He builds this church in honor of his daughter, Jenny Louise. Now, he doesn't want her memory to fade. He wants to have the dedication to the church on the 1-year anniversary of her passing. And paying as many as 300 workers to work day and night shifts, this church is completed 6 days before the 1-year anniversary. This is a less than 1-year construction. When you're that rich and that motivated, things get done. Now, the dedication was impressive as well. In attendance was Mrs. Benjamin Harrison, First Lady of the United States. Levi Morton and his wife, he was the vice president at that time, along with other dignitaries from around the country. The construction's impressive as well. This is also a poured concrete structure. The dome on top is copper, and it's from Rome, Italy. Inside the church, the pipe organ, which is still functional, 5,000 pipes. Now, this church is open for visitors only on Friday, 11 in the morning to 3:30 in the afternoon. And the doorway for those free self-guided tours is that very ornate doorway right there, which is a nice doorway. Back in the Flagler era, that would have been your women's and children's entrance. Gentlemen's entrance is on the front, and just slightly more ornate. Just slightly more ornate. And how do they deny the Moorish influence? It almost looks like a mosque. Yeah. And also find it ironic that you have a separate women's and children's entrance to a building dedicated to a woman. Now, the Ponce de Leon was made up of 5 major buildings. All the way to the right, which looks like one huge building, is actually 2. That is the front of the hotel. That's also where your higher price rooms are located. Your third building, if you look straight through this live oak tree here, you see a lighter colored balcony, just slightly to our right, straight ahead. See that lighter colored balcony? That is your grand ballroom for the hotel. The fourth building is on the other side of the gazebo. That's where your lesser price rooms are located, due to their proximity to the 5th building, which was the generator house, due to the noise factor. This is the first hotel in the world to be completely lit with electricity. That is 3 years ahead of the White House having electric lights. The generators are personally built for Mr. Flagler by Thomas Edison, a personal friend of his. Second wife, the nurse, Ida Alice. Ida Alice Shords is her maiden name. Well, toward the end of the 1880s, she is starting to show signs of insanity. She is prone to explosive outbursts in public, many times quite violent and threatening, usually against people she doesn't even know and isn't even in a conversation with. But most people are ignoring this because she is married to one of the most powerful men in the world. But by 1895, it is undeniable. She is slipping into insanity and away from reality. And she is committed at that point. Now, Henry Flagler is someone alone in the world now. First wife's dead, second wife's committed. Eldest daughter died from childbirth. Second daughter, Carrie, died at age 3. She's been dead for decades. But he has a son, Harry, who has been grooming to take over the family business. Been working here in Florida a couple of years with the railroad and the hotels. And at this point in Harry's life, he decides he's going to get married. Marries a young lady from New York City who hates Florida. Convinces Harry to leave his family business, pursue interest in the New York City area. Henry is furious. And also alone in the world now. And at this point, he starts to befriend and eventually date who will become his third wife, Mary Lily Keenan from North Carolina. She's everything that a Gilded Age wife is supposed to be for a rich man. She comes from money, well-born, educated in the ways, behaving like a lady in public. She's been to finishing school. She's every bit the intellectual and social equal of Mr. Flagler. And she is 36 years younger than he is. But there is one problem. He's still married to the second wife. And at this point in history, you can't divorce your spouse for them being crazy. Not in New York or Florida. And this situation continues for 6 years until 1901, when a law is passed in the state of Florida. And that law states if your spouse is legally and incurably insane, it is grounds for divorce. 10 days after that law passes, Mr. Flagler's divorced. 2 weeks after that, he's remarried to the third wife. The next legislative session, that law is overturned. It is a one-person law. Only one person takes advantage of it, literally named the Flagler divorce law. To represent his interest in the state legislature, he has hired a gentleman we would call a lobbyist today, former justice on the Florida Supreme Court by the name of Mitchell, who also happens to be a previous governor of the state of Florida. And if he's not politically connected, no one is. That, along with a few key donations to key representatives around the state, and boom, you have a divorce law just like that. Gives you an idea of the power of Henry Flagler in the state of Florida. Now, don't feel bad for the second wife, Ida Alice. Yes, she is committed for the rest of her life. She is sent to an asylum in Central Valley, New York called Falkirk. Falkirk is not your typical horror movie insane asylum. It is a 40-acre property with 16 patients. Everyone has their own private country villa with staff. It's not exactly struggling. To make sure she has an income of her own, she's given 2,600 shares of Standard Oil. The annual dividend from that's more than $100,000 a year in that year's money. Also, he takes care of all of her expenses, which are quite extravagant. When he dies in 1913, his estate takes care of her expenses. She finally passes away in 1930. She's outlived everyone, including the young third wife, and her personal net worth is north of $15 million. But it pales in comparison to the third wife's estate. When Henry dies in 1913, 17 years prior, his third wife inherits an estate worth more than $155 million. That is $4.67 billion in today's money. She becomes the richest woman in the country overnight. Before you get all excited, though, about Mary Lily Keenan Flagler and a newfound power in the world, put it in historical context. Yes, she's the richest woman in the country and still doesn't have the right to vote. And at that point in history, women aren't thought to be able to handle large sums of money. When Mr. Flagler passes away, the court forcibly appoints her a legal guardian. She's in her late 40s and now has to have a legal guardian. Luckily, the court appoints her younger brother, William Keenan Jr., who's a pretty good guy. But it gives us an idea of just how far women have come in this country in just the last century. Women, of course, get the right to vote with the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, the Women's Suffrage Act of 1920. In comparison, off the top of your head, does anyone know when black men were given the federal right to vote in this country? It's the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, and it is 1870. 50 years ahead of women. Don't see that much in pop culture today. It's not very popular amongst themes today, but that is the actual truth. Now, Henry Flagler, from this point, during the situation we called it, he has continued to extend the railroad south. He's continuing to buy, build, or refurbish luxury hotels along the way. Ormond Beach, Daytona, Palm Beach, Miami, and eventually pays for a second hotel to be built in Key West. Now, welcome to the front of Flagler College, also the front of the old Ponce de Leon Hotel. The only difference between the two, there was no statue of Henry Flagler out front. Didn't have that big of an ego, and it didn't say Flagler College on this arch. Other than that, it's original and unchanged. Now, the second hotel Mr. Flagler built, the one with all the amenities inside, right across the street. The Alcazar Hotel opened its doors January of 1889 the following year. Inside the Alcazar, you'd find things like bowling alleys, gentlemen's clubs, gambling halls, taverns, wet and dry saunas, exercise rooms. Out back was an entire Italian-style plaza that had croquet, play tennis courts, and you could even learn to ride a bicycle, and the Alcazar Bicycle Academy, all the rage at the time. But the centerpiece of the hotel, if you look straight down the side of the old hotel, you see a rounded area at the back of the building. If we went down the next street, you would see the same exact thing. That is each end of the world's largest indoor swimming pool at the time.
Oh, wow.
It's literally a city block long. Statue of Ponce de Leon there.
Oh, there he is.
Founder of Florida for the Spanish in the year 1513. First of all, his real name is Juan Ponce. It's not Ponce de Leon. He's from Leon. His full title is Don Juan Ponce de Leon, Mr. Juan Ponce of Leon. Everybody calls him Ponce de Leon, so I will too. Tremendous resume on this man as an explorer, conquistador, and administrator. He's on Christopher Columbus's second voyage to the New World. He is a 3-time governor of Puerto Rico and basically built modern Puerto Rico. But during his second stint as governor, well, he is caught up in a power struggle in the Spanish government. The old admiral of the seas was Christopher Columbus. The new one is his son Diego, who does not care for Ponce de Leon, and has him removed as the governor of Puerto Rico. Ponce de Leon's already a legend in his own time, so the king makes a deal with him. You sail west, any land you discover, governor for life. First thing he hits is Bimini Island in the Bahamas. Claims it. Basically a glorified sandbar, so he keeps going. Unbeknownst to him at that point, the Gulf Stream is sweeping him north.
And he comes ashore on Florida, 30 degrees, 8 minutes northern latitude, just north of where we are right now. It claims the entire area in the name of Spain. That's April 2nd of 1513. It's right in the middle of the Easter season. It's also in the middle of Spain's Festival of Flowers. Florida is very lush, especially in April. So he thinks to name this new land La Florida, or the Land of Flowers. Well done, Ponce de Leon. It's been that ever since. The only reason he actually comes ashore, he's out of fresh water. Fresh water, besides a boat, is the most important thing on the open ocean. He sees a large native village. He knows they have to have fresh water. People are living there. It's the Timucuan village of Saloy. Now, the Timucuan, not afraid of the Spanish. In fact, their civilization at that point in history stretches from present-day South Carolina to about Cape Canaveral and all the way over to the west coast of Florida. They're a good 400,000 strong population-wise and not afraid of 50 Spaniards in one boat. But they're always looking for new trading partners. And I'm sure they could tell these guys weren't local by the boat they were in. Ponce de Leon even noted in his journal as he's sailing down the coast, the natives are on the shore waving them in, hawking their wares on the beaches of Florida in the early 1500s. He comes ashore and it's a friendly encounter. They trade trinkets back and forth. He does fill up his water cask, and he notes a few things in his journal. First of all, how healthy everyone is, which I find a bit ominous. Second, how tall both the men and the women are. By the way, the Timucuan are a matriarchal society. Power passes through the woman's side of the family. Most of your Timucuan chiefs are women. And third, how long-lived some of these people appear to be. He sees individuals he thinks are in their 80s and 90s. Some may be over 100 years old. Now, this is at a time in history where the Spanish are commonly dying in their 40s and 50s. Notes all that in his journals, and he sails away. He's headed back to Puerto Rico. But he's having a terrible time getting there because he is fighting a brutal ocean current. At that point, he is the first European to document the Gulf Stream. Huge discovery for all Europeans in the New World, because utilizing the Gulf Stream cuts a month off the trip back to Europe. It's a nice discovery. Makes it back to Puerto Rico, returns to Florida in 1521. He's here to establish a colony. But he picks the west coast of Florida, about where Port Charlotte is today, because that's closer to the new frontier for the Spanish, which is Mexico. But he runs into a different group of natives called the Calusa. They are not as friendly as the Timucuan. In a battle with the Calusa, he takes an arrow to the upper thigh. He is the first European surgical patient in all of North America. It is not always good to be first at something. He does survive the surgery, but dies 2 weeks later in Havana, most likely infections from that surgery. And he's buried today in San Juan, Puerto Rico, near a statue that is identical to that one. There's a company out of Memphis that did a casting of that one to create this one. And this one's been here since 1923. In San Juan, he's pointing toward the west, toward the lands that he discovered. Here he appears to be threatening Georgia. No idea why that statue points north. If they had any cool about them, they would have pointed the two statues at each other. You, Ponce, no. You, Ponce. They didn't do that. But you'll notice nowhere in that story did I say the term fountain of youth. Because he's not looking for it. It's a myth of history. In the late 1600s, more than a century after his passing, Spanish historians are reading his journals. The Timucuan people he refers to, they have no idea who that is. Because the Timucuan they know around their present-day St. Augustine no longer long-lived and healthy. They have been riddled with European diseases. So they think he may have discovered an entirely different group of people. And whoever they were, they must have had access to the mythical fountain of youth to be so long-lived and healthy. So they rewrite history, that he's looking for the fountain of youth when he certainly was not. History can be cruel. With all the things this man accomplished in his life, the one thing he's known for, he had nothing to do with. So welcome to the Castillo de San Marcos, our old port here in St. Augustine. This is actually the reason we have historic tourism here. This is our anchor, if you will. This is the oldest stone fortress in all of North America. Built between 1672 and 1695. It did take 23 years to build. Shouldn't have. Should have only taken 3 to 4. We just didn't have enough labor to get it done. Now this is actually our fort number 10 here in St. Augustine. We had 9 previous forts in this general area, but they were all made out of wood. Wood in a coastal environment just doesn't last. Once this one was made out of coquina, no need for any other. Now the fort's military history is perfect. It is undefeated in its entire military history. From its completion in 1695 till its final decommissioning in the year 1900. That's 205 years of winning. 12-0 technically. 10 minor assaults, 2 major attacks. Nobody ever came close to taking this fort by force. Changed hands a few times due to treaties, but that's activities in other parts of the world, never because of activities here. And the secret of the fort's success is an accident. It's the coquina stone it's built out of. Now, the Spanish used coquina because that was the only stone in the area. Turns out it's cannonball proof. That was handy. Now, today we know scientifically, when the coquina dries out, it leaves air pockets all throughout the stone. When a cannonball strikes coquina, the air pockets will collapse and absorb the shock, like a super styrofoam. Cannonballs striking coquina will either go into the coquina, sometimes several feet deep, or bounce off depending on the angle and the velocity. But if this were made of another stone that was solid, cannonball strikes that, the shock would radiate out, and that stone would shatter. Not this fort. This fort is cannonball proof, and that's why she's undefeated. Now, this is part of the National Park Service. If you have a National Park pass, you get free entrance along with 3 other people. Now, from here, we can see a lot of things. First of all, our lower moat, where the livestock would have been held. The second level of the moat was called the Covered Way, and it would allow the Spanish soldiers to come out and fend off a land attack behind the protection or cover provided by this 5 to 6 foot coquina wall. But if you look right in the corner of the fort, you see a huge crack right under the guard tower, the grate, a huge crack running diagonally down to the ground. Now, there are dozens of cracks like that around the fort, and that is the evidence of this fort's near destruction. In 1938, the fort is taken over by the National Park Service. Now, the Park Service comes in here, they want to turn this into a tourist attraction, naturally. But they don't do any research into the fort, how it's built, or what it's built out of. They just want to make it appealing to tourists. And they make a rather bad decision. Let's dam up the lower moat, fill it up with water to make it look like an English castle. That'll make people want to come see it. Not realizing that coquina absorbs water.
Right.
So they have the Army Corps of Engineers build the dams. Fill it up with 3 to 4 feet of water, and within months, the water's gone. They think they have a leak. The fort has absorbed it. So they build a system of pumps to keep the water replenished.
Okay, gosh.
3 to 4 feet deep for the next nearly 60 years. The entire time the fort is soaking up, becoming heavier and heavier, and finally starts to crumble under its own weight. They realized their mistake in 1996.
Oh my God.
Maybe the water we're putting in the moat's causing the fort to crumble under our feet. Tear down the dams, the water drains out naturally. But it takes the fort 10 years to dry out and stop moving. It has since then. They have mortared all the cracks. She is solid once more. Now, I love the Park Service and what they do for this country. But I also kind of like to pick on these guys a little bit by telling them what no invading force could do in 205 years. They almost did accidentally in 60. The only portion of our city wall that still remains today from the colonial era. Now, the only parts that are colonial. First of all, the high stone walls on either side are the oldest part of this structure. They are original city wall construction. They date to at least 1704. They also show you the actual height of the city wall. The pillars are colonial, but they're not original. Originally, they were made out of wood, but wood doesn't last in a coastal environment. And they were replaced in 1808 with coquina, and they've been there ever since. But everything else is recreation, including the bridge we're on. Most of this bridge would have been a drawbridge. And each and every night, that drawbridge is closed up tight. St. Augustine is a very nervous city. As a result of the 1702 siege, we are now the northernmost outpost of the Spanish Empire. And with all those British colonies to the north that have shown us several times they would love to take us over, we're hiding behind our high walls and our overbuilt fort. Now, the reason the city gates are on this end of the city, it's your only land access to St. Augustine. Remember, it sits on a peninsula surrounded by rivers. So if you're going to walk into the city, you have to walk in from the north. If you're going to march an army in, they would have to march in from the north. For that very reason, 2 to 3 miles to the north of the city was practically nothing. No buildings, no trees, no bushes. The Spanish keep it cut down as flat as they possibly can. Hey, you take the vegetation off Florida, she's flat as a pancake. Line of sight. See 2 to 3 miles to the north very easily. Any military comes in there with bad intentions, the big cannons on this side of the fort are perfectly positioned to cut them to shreds. Well-defensed, well-fortified city.